He was just an elderly man, quietly settling into his first-class seat, excited to visit his grandson for the first time in years. But before the plane even took off, a flight attendant marched up to him, demanding he move, loudly, in front of everyone. Passengers watched in stunned silence as she insisted he didn't belong there. But what she didn't know? The man she was humiliating had far more power than she ever could have imagined. And just 5 minutes later, she would regret everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. He sat quietly in his seat, adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped through an old, worn-out book. His hands, rough with age, trembled slightly as he turned the page. The excitement in his heart was hard to contain. After years of waiting, he was finally going to see his grandson. The boy had saved up for months to surprise him with a first-class ticket, a gesture that meant more than words could express. He had dressed neatly for the occasion, wearing his best blazer, polished shoes, and a warm smile. The soft hum of the airplane filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, chatting or scrolling through their phones. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering practiced smiles to the first-class passengers. Her uniform was crisp, her posture upright, and her expression carried an air of authority. She moved with confidence, greeting each traveler with polite words, until her eyes landed on him. Her steps slowed, her polite expression faded into something unreadable. She glanced at his face, then down at his hands resting on the book, and then at his seat number. Her brows knit together slightly, and without hesitation she took a step closer. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" Her voice was firm but laced with the kind of doubt that made his stomach tighten. He looked up, blinking in surprise. "Of course," he said, reaching into his pocket. His fingers carefully pulled out the small piece of paper, neatly folded. He handed it to her with a slight smile, expecting her to simply verify it and move on. But she didn't. Instead, she frowned as she studied the ticket, flipping it back and forth as if searching for a flaw. "This is a first-class ticket," she said slowly, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," he nodded, still polite. "My grandson got it for me as a gift." She let out a short, skeptical breath, tapping her fingers against the ticket. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, I am," he answered, his voice steady but softer now. A few nearby passengers lifted their heads slightly, sensing something was happening. She handed the ticket back, but her stance didn't change. "I just need to check something. Give me a moment." Without waiting for a reply, she turned on her heels and walked toward the front of the cabin. He let out a slow breath, feeling the shift in the air. It was a small moment, a brief interaction, but something about it didn't sit right. He adjusted his blazer, sitting up straighter, trying to ignore the way some of the other passengers were now stealing glances at him, whispering among themselves. Minutes passed, and she returned, her face unreadable. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. There seems to be a mix-up with your ticket." His heart skipped a beat. "A mix-up?" "Yes," she said, her tone sharper now. "This seat is for first-class passengers. You must have been assigned a different section." He felt his face grow warm, his hands tightening around the armrest. "There is no mistake, this is my seat." The flight attendant folded her arms. "Sir, I don't want to make this difficult. Please take your belongings and move to the back." A silence stretched between them. His chest tightened, but he refused to argue. Instead, he reached for his bag, moving slowly, carefully. The whispers grew louder. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to see, while others watched with quiet interest, waiting to see what would happen next. As he stood up, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers typed a message quickly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he slid the phone back into his pocket, picked up his bag, and began walking toward the back of the plane. What the flight attendant didn't know, that message had just changed everything. He walked down the narrow aisle, feeling the weight of every step. The murmurs of the passengers brushed against his ears, some barely above a whisper, others not bothering to hide their curiosity. His grip on his bag tightened, not because it was heavy, but because his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from something deeper. He had experienced moments like this before. He had seen the way people's eyes shifted when they assumed he didn't belong. But this time, it was different. This time, the assumptions had taken something from him, something he had been looking forward to. As he reached the economy section, he lowered himself into an empty seat near the back. The space was cramped, the seat much smaller than the plush first-class chair he had been assigned. He exhaled slowly, resting his hands on his knees, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. The humiliation burned deep, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. One unread message. "What do you mean they made you move?" He took a breath before typing his response. "They said there was a mix-up with my ticket. Asked me to go to economy." The reply came almost immediately. "Who asked you?" His fingers hesitated before typing back. "The flight attendant." For a moment, he considered leaving it at that, but something in his gut told him to add more. "She didn't even check properly. Just assumed I was in the wrong place." There was a long pause before the next response came. "What's the flight number?" He glanced at his boarding pass, then typed out the number and sent it. He didn't know what would happen next, but something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. At the front of the plane, the flight attendant returned to her duties, her expression neutral, as if the encounter had already left her mind. She continued offering drinks, straightening trays, and greeting passengers. But in the first-class cabin, the air felt different. A few travelers exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One woman, seated a few rows ahead, whispered to her husband. That didn't seem right. He nodded but said nothing, choosing instead to stare out the window. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, the overhead announcement instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The flight attendant gave one final glance down the aisle before stepping into the galley at the front. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sighing in contentment. To her it was just another flight, another routine moment. She had no idea that the next announcement over the intercom would have her name in it. And when it came, she wouldn't be smiling anymore. The plane moved steadily along the runway, the soft vibrations humming beneath the passengers' feet. The flight attendant took a slow sip of her coffee, oblivious to the ripple effect of her actions. She had done her job the way she always did, swift, firm, and unquestioning. As far as she was concerned, there had been no real issue. If the man had been in the wrong seat, then correcting the mistake was her responsibility. It wasn't personal. It was procedure. Or so she thought. A sudden crackle from the intercom broke through the quiet murmur of the cabin. The captain's voice, steady and firm, carried through the speakers. "Ms. Taylor, please report to the cockpit immediately." The cup in her hand paused mid-air. A few passengers turned their heads slightly, their curiosity piqued. A request like that wasn't common, especially before takeoff. The flight attendant straightened her posture, quickly setting down her cup and smoothing her uniform. With measured steps, she made her way through the first-class cabin, ignoring the glances being thrown her way. Reaching the cockpit door, she tapped lightly before stepping inside. The captain, a man with years of experience, turned in his seat. His face was unreadable, but his sharp eyes locked onto her the moment she entered. Next to him, the co-pilot glanced at her briefly before looking away. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, a voice crackled through the in-flight phone mounted on the panel. "Is she there?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, but carried a weight that sent a strange sense of unease down her spine. It was the flight operations manager, a man who rarely, if ever, intervened in real-time flight matters. The captain nodded slightly before pressing a button. "Yes, she's here." The next words from the phone made her stomach tighten. "Ms. Taylor, we just received a direct call from corporate. There has been a serious complaint regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. We need an explanation, now." Her heart skipped. She forced a composed expression and cleared her throat. Yes, sir. There was a gentleman sitting in first class who, after reviewing his ticket, I believed was mistakenly seated there. To ensure proper seating arrangements, I directed him to economy. Silence. Then the voice returned, colder this time. Did you verify his ticket through the system? Her mouth opened, but she hesitated. She had checked it, yes, but not thoroughly. She had seen it, assumed it was incorrect, and made a judgment. The pause was enough for the operations manager to continue. Did you confirm with the gate agent before removing him from his seat? Her throat went dry. No, sir, she admitted, her voice quieter now. A slow, heavy exhale came from the other end of the line. Ms. Taylor, do you even know who that man is? For the first time since stepping into the cockpit, uncertainty flickered across her face. She swallowed hard. No, sir. The captain turned fully in his seat now, his expression grim. His name is Mr. Harris. Not only is he a long-time first-class traveler with our airline, but his grandson is a corporate partner, one of the key investors who ensures this airline continues to operate. Her breath hitched. The air in the cockpit suddenly felt thinner. The manager's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You didn't just remove a passenger, Ms. Taylor. You humiliated someone who has more influence over this airline than you do over this flight. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The captain's gaze hardened. We have been given direct instructions from corporate, he said, his voice steady. You will return to Mr. Harris, personally apologize, and escort him back to first class in front of every passenger. Her stomach twisted. The operations manager wasn't finished. And when this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive office. Your employment status will be reviewed immediately. A cold wave of realization settled over her. She had never been spoken to like this before. Not by a captain, not by corporate, not by anyone. She had made snap judgments in the past, had handled passengers the way she saw fit, but never had it come back to her like this. Never had she been questioned like this. The call ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was deafening. The captain gave her one last look before turning back to his controls. Fix your mistake. Her legs felt heavy as she turned and walked out of the cockpit. She wasn't sure what was worse, the humiliation of what she was about to do or the fact that it was about to happen in front of everyone. She stepped out of the cockpit, her heart pounding in a way it never had before. The cabin seemed quieter than before, though she knew it was just her own awareness sharpening. The overhead lights cast a dull glow over the rows of passengers, their faces half lit, some staring out their windows, others lost in their own worlds. But she could feel it, eyes shifting toward her, quiet murmurs rising as she made her way back down the aisle. Her uniform, once a source of authority, now felt like a weighted chain pulling her down with every step. She reached the economy section, where Mr. Harris sat by the window, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed outside. The seat he occupied was noticeably smaller, the space tighter than what he had been forced to leave behind. His travel bag sat tucked under his feet, untouched since he had been made to move. The flight attendant swallowed hard. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but she knew there was no escaping it. Slowly, she crouched slightly so that she was at his level, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Sir, she began, her voice quieter than before, lacking its earlier firmness. There's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Harris didn't move right away. His expression didn't shift. His breathing remained even. But there was something in the way he held himself, still, composed, unwavering, that made her more uncomfortable than if he had been visibly angry. She cleared her throat and continued, I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. For the first time since she had approached, Mr. Harris turned to face her fully. His gaze was calm but piercing, his silence louder than anything she could have said. He studied her for a long moment, and in that silence, the power shifted completely. Nearby passengers, who had previously ignored the earlier scene, now listened intently. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats, Others subtly turned their heads, pretending not to watch while not missing a word. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice steady, his tone giving away nothing. The flight attendant hesitated. "Yes, there was," she struggled for the right words. "An error in seating." Mr. Harris tilted his head slightly. "An error?" he repeated. "Or a choice?" The murmur in the cabin grew. People exchanged glances. They had heard everything earlier. They knew he was right. She exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the seat in front of her for balance. I misjudged you." The words tasted foreign on her tongue. She had never been the one to admit fault before. Mr. Harris said nothing at first. He simply let her words linger in the air, making sure she felt the weight of them. Then, he reached for his bag, lifting it with careful hands, moving deliberately, unhurried. He didn't rush back to first class. He didn't let her dictate the pace anymore. As he stood, he looked her in the eye once more and said, "If you're going to apologize, please be honest about why you did it." A few passengers let out quiet gasps. The ones who had pretended not to see what had happened earlier suddenly felt exposed. They had witnessed injustice and said nothing. And now, they were watching someone be held accountable for it. The flight attendant felt her face burn, her throat dry. She wanted to escape the moment, to end this conversation as quickly as possible. But she had no control over it anymore. Without another word, Mr. Harris stepped past her and walked back toward first class. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't look around for validation. He simply returned to the place he had been denied, his back straight, his steps measured. She followed behind him, her presence now reduced to a shadow trailing a man who had already won. And with every step she realized, she hadn't just lost control of the situation, she had lost something far greater. The first-class cabin fell into an eerie silence as Mr. Harris stepped back into the space he had rightfully belonged to from the start. The air felt heavier now, different from before. The flight attendant, still trailing behind him, could feel the shift, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down on her. The same passengers who had barely acknowledged Mr. Harris earlier now looked at him with something else: shame, curiosity, quiet guilt. He lowered himself into his seat, slow and deliberate, as if reclaiming it wasn't just about comfort but about something far deeper. He placed his bag beside him and adjusted his blazer before finally looking up at the flight attendant. She stood stiffly, her hands clasped together in front of her, her usual authority stripped away. For the first time she felt truly small. "If there's anything you need," she said, forcing her voice to remain professional, "please let me know." Mr. Harris didn't answer right away. He reached for his seatbelt, buckling it calmly. Only then did he tilt his head slightly and look at her with the same quiet intensity as before. "You didn't ask me that when I first sat down." The words were soft, but they hit with the force of a tidal wave. A few rows away, a businessman cleared his throat uncomfortably. A woman clutched the edges of her blanket a little tighter. The silence stretched long enough for the weight of the moment to settle on every single person in the cabin. The flight attendant's fingers curled slightly. She started, but nothing useful came out. Mr. Harris nodded once, as if that was all the answer he needed. He turned away from her then, calmly opening the in-flight magazine, signaling that the conversation was over. The flight attendant swallowed hard, the usual rhythm of her job, serving drinks, smiling at passengers walking through the cabin with confidence, felt impossible now. She was still standing there, stuck in place, as if waiting for some kind of escape from the moment. But there was none. With nothing left to say, she turned abruptly and walked back toward the front galley, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She didn't even make it 3 steps before another voice stopped her cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Her breath caught. She turned slightly, hearing the slight crackle of the intercom fill the cabin. "We'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for the earlier disruption. Our first-class passenger, Mr. Harris, has been returned to his original seat where he should have been all along. We deeply appreciate his loyalty to our airline." A slow ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. A few passengers nodded in approval. Others lowered their heads, shifting awkwardly in their seats. But the real blow came next. "Ms. Taylor, please report to the galley immediately." The announcement rang in her ears. The humiliation washed over her in waves, each one stronger than the last. Passengers stared now, openly, no longer hiding their curiosity. Some with amusement, others with disapproval. The ones who had ignored what happened before were suddenly paying full attention now. She felt her legs turn weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move. With stiff steps, she walked toward the front of the cabin, past the passengers who had just witnessed what might have been the most public correction of her career. She had made a mistake and everyone had seen it. But the worst part? Her punishment wasn't over yet. She stepped into the front galley, her breath uneven, her pulse hammering in her ears. The space that had once been her domain, where she moved with confidence and authority, now felt like a cage. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but it did nothing to drown out the weight pressing down on her chest. The moment she stopped, the in-flight phone buzzed sharply. She flinched before quickly reaching for it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed it to her ear. "This is Ms. Taylor," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The voice on the other end wasn't the captain's. It was deeper, smoother, and far more unsettling. "This is Dominic Carter." Her stomach twisted. The name alone sent a cold wave through her. Dominic Carter, the executive overseeing operations for the airline. The same man who made decisions about staffing, policies, and, more importantly, terminations. He didn't waste time. "We need to have a conversation about your handling of Mr. Harris," he said. "You removed a first-class passenger without verifying his credentials, publicly humiliated him, and caused an unnecessary disruption. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Her throat tightened. I was just following procedure," she said quickly. "I believed there was a seating error and You didn't believe," he cut her off sharply. "You assumed." She felt a lump form in her throat. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. There was a pause, and then his tone grew even colder. "You will personally file a full incident report when this flight lands. You will also be required to meet with the executive board to explain why you believed it was appropriate to remove a long-standing VIP passenger without confirmation." She swallowed hard. "Sir, That is not a request." His voice carried the weight of finality. A lump of panic settled in her stomach. Her hands, normally steady, were damp against the phone's surface. "There was one more thing. Effective immediately, your employment status is under review." The words crushed her like a blow to the chest. She felt dizzy for a moment, as if the entire plane had tilted beneath her feet. "Do you understand?" She forced herself to respond, even though her voice barely came out. "Yes, sir." The line clicked off. She lowered the phone slowly, her fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was no longer in control. For years she had dictated the rules inside the cabin, managing passengers with confidence, ensuring things ran the way she thought they should. Now she wasn't even sure if she'd have a job by the time this plane landed. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. She stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her breath shallow. The reality of the situation was sinking in fast, like water filling a sinking ship. Her mind raced, searching for some way out of this, some explanation that could soften the blow, but deep down, she knew. There was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. The murmurs from the first-class cabin hadn't faded. She could still feel their eyes on her, their judgment wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She had spent years making quick decisions, enforcing the rules, ensuring order in her own way. But now, for the first time, she wasn't the one handing out consequences. She was the one receiving them. A soft shuffle of footsteps made her tense. Another flight attendant, one of the newer hires, a quiet woman named Hannah, stood a few feet away, watching her with an expression that was hard to read. "They just called from corporate, didn't they?" Hannah asked, her voice careful. Ms. Taylor's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Hannah let out a small sigh. "They wouldn't have done that if it wasn't serious." Ms. Taylor shot her a sharp look. "I don't need your commentary right now." Hannah raised her hand slightly. "I'm not trying to make things worse, but let's be honest. You never even checked his ticket properly, did you?" The words hit like a slap. Ms. Taylor's grip on the counter tightened. "Mind your business," she muttered. But Hannah didn't move. She tilted her head slightly, studying Ms. Taylor like she was seeing her for the first time. "You know, I watched the whole thing," she said after a moment. "You questioned him, but you never questioned anyone else in first class. Just him." Ms. Taylor's stomach twisted. Hannah exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "I've seen how you treat certain passengers." Ms. Taylor's eyes snapped to hers, defensive. "Excuse me?" Hannah didn't back down. "You heard me." She glanced toward the first-class cabin. "The only difference this time? You picked the wrong person." Ms. Taylor wanted to snap back, wanted to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down she knew Hannah was right. A beat of silence passed before Hannah turned to leave, but before she did, she said one last thing. "You should start thinking about what you're going to say when we land." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Ms. Taylor standing there, alone in the galley, drowning in the realization that her career was crumbling around her. The plane had barely been in the air for an hour, but she already knew this was going to be the longest flight of her life. The minutes crawled by, but for Ms. Taylor, they felt like hours. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her fingers ached. Her throat was dry, her chest tight. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her like a crushing force, making it harder to breathe. The humiliation, the judgment, the knowledge that she had made an irreversible mistake. It was all sinking in too fast. She had spent her entire career controlling situations, making sure things ran smoothly. Passengers followed her instructions without question. She had always been firm, authoritative, the kind of flight attendant who demanded respect. But now she wasn't the one giving instructions. She was the one being told what to do. And it burned. She tried to steady her breathing, to push down the rising panic in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she could salvage this. Maybe when they landed she could explain herself, reason with corporate, tell them that it was all just a misunderstanding. But a voice in the back of her mind, the voice she had been ignoring, whispered the truth. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a choice. She had looked at Mr. Harris and assumed without hesitation that he didn't belong in first class. She hadn't questioned it. She hadn't given it a second thought. She had treated him differently without even realizing it, until now. And now it was too late. A sharp knock on the galley wall startled her. She turned quickly, finding herself face to face with the captain. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist even tighter. "You're needed back in first class," he said simply. She blinked. "For what?" The captain didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. "Because Mr. Harris has requested to speak with you." Her heart nearly stopped. For a brief second she thought about refusing, about pretending she hadn't heard him, but she knew that wasn't an option. Without another word, she smoothed down her uniform, straightened her posture, and stepped out of the galley. The walk back to first class felt longer this time, even though it was only a few rows away. She could feel the passengers watching her, their gazes heavier than before. Some of them had seen everything, some had only heard whispers, but they all knew something was happening. When she finally reached Mr. Harris's seat, she hesitated. He sat comfortably now, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaking with rage or demanding justice. That somehow made it worse. She cleared her throat. "Sir, you asked to see me?" Mr. Harris closed the magazine he had been flipping through and looked up at her. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze steady. "Yes," he said simply. "I have a question." She forced herself to nod. "Of course." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocking in his lap. "Why?" She swallowed. I'm not sure what you mean." His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in this seat?" The silence that followed was suffocating. A few passengers subtly turned their heads, pretending not to listen while hanging on to every word. She opened her mouth, searching for something to say. Anything that would make this moment less painful. But no excuse felt right. She could say it was a mistake, that she had misread the ticket, that she had been in a rush, distracted. But they both knew that wasn't true. And then, to her shock, Mr. Harris tilted his head and said, "You don't have to answer me." Her mouth went dry. I already know the answer," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen it happen before. I've lived through it too many times to count." She felt a lump rise in her throat. The passengers around them weren't speaking, but their presence was deafening. "I've been traveling for years," Mr. Harris continued. "I've flown first class more times than I can remember. But somehow, people like you still look at me and assume I don't belong." She felt her face heat up. The shame, the regret, the sheer weight of his words settled over her like a blanket she couldn't shake off. Mr. Harris let out a slow breath, then shook his head. "I don't need an apology. I don't even need you to admit what you did." She blinked. "You don't?" "No," he said simply. "Because you already know, and so does everyone else on this plane." His words weren't loud, they weren't angry, but they carried more weight than any punishment she could receive. For the first time in her career, she realized she had lost something she couldn't get back: respect. Without another word, Mr. Harris picked up his magazine again, flipping it open as if the conversation was finished. Because it was. And Ms. Taylor? She had never felt smaller in her life. She turned stiffly, her legs heavy as she walked away from Mr. Harris. The passengers around her weren't speaking, but their silence was louder than anything she had ever heard. Their glances, their subtle shifts in their seats, the way they looked at her but quickly turned away. It was all too much. She made it to the galley and gripped the counter, her breathing uneven. She wanted to disappear, to wake up and have this entire flight erased from existence. But there was no escape. She had been seen. Not just by Mr. Harris, not just by a handful of passengers, but by everyone. She had spent years making quick judgments, keeping order in the way she saw fit. And until now, she had never been forced to question any of it. But this time, there was no hiding from what she had done. The in-flight phone buzzed again. She stared at it, her stomach twisting painfully. She already knew who it would be. With a shaking hand, she picked it up and pressed it to her ear. "This is Ms. Taylor." The voice on the other end was cool and emotionless. "This is corporate security." Her fingers tightened around the receiver. "When the plane lands, you are to remain on board until security personnel escorts you from the aircraft. Do you understand?" Her mouth felt like sandpaper. "Yes," she croaked. There was a pause, and then the voice continued. "You will not interact with Mr. Harris or any other passenger after landing. You will proceed directly to the executive office for further review. Any refusal to comply will result in immediate termination." The word termination hit her like a slap. For the first time, the reality of the situation fully crashed down on her. This wasn't just a disciplinary action. This wasn't just a warning. She was about to lose everything. Her career, her stability, everything she had spent the last decade building. The line clicked dead. She placed the phone down, but her hand wouldn't stop shaking. For years, she had been in control. The one giving orders, the one making decisions, the one enforcing rules. And now she was the one being told where to sit, what to do, who to answer to. The irony wasn't lost on her. The overhead announcement came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions." She swallowed hard, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her standing. She had spent so much time looking at passengers like Mr. Harris, as though they were beneath first class. But in just a few short hours, she had become the one at the bottom. And soon she wouldn't be a flight attendant at all. Down the aisle, Mr. Harris sat calmly. He had felt every shift in the energy of the plane. He had seen the way passengers sat awkwardly, the way some of them looked at him with newfound respect, while others looked at him with guilt. They had all seen it happen. They had watched him be humiliated, and none of them had spoken up. And now they were witnessing the fallout. He had been quiet for most of the flight. He didn't believe in making a scene, in demanding things be fixed with loud voices or aggression. He had learned long ago that power didn't always come from volume. It came from presence. He didn't need to humiliate her in return. He didn't need to demand an apology. She was already facing something far worse than anything he could have said. The realization of what she had done. The weight of a mistake that would follow her long after this plane landed. The reality that in less than an hour, she would no longer be employed. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his seatbelt. She had thought she was above him, but as the plane started its descent, she was the one who would be walking off in shame, and he would walk off with his head held high. The plane began its slow descent, the familiar pressure shift making passengers adjust in their seats. Overhead compartments rattled softly, the engines hummed at a lower pitch, and outside the window the sprawling city below came into view, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. Mr. Harris remained still, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes calm as he stared out at the horizon. This wasn't his first flight. It wasn't even his first time dealing with someone like Ms. Taylor. But this time, something was different. This time, the person who had wronged him wasn't walking away untouched. For decades, he had learned to pick his battles. He had grown up in a world that demanded patience from men like him, where raising your voice only made people turn away faster. He had learned to sit through the discomfort, to swallow his pride, to let things slide because that's just the way things were. But not today. Today he hadn't had to fight. He hadn't had to yell. He hadn't had to demand anything. He had let the weight of truth do all the work. The same people who had sat silently when he was forced from his seat now avoided his gaze. A few, embarrassed by their own inaction, had tried to offer small, awkward smiles, as if that would somehow erase what had happened. He hadn't smiled back, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had happened countless times before, to countless others. With no justice at all. This time justice had come swiftly, and it had come without him lifting a finger. In the galley, Ms. Taylor's hands trembled. The descent felt faster than usual. Every second brought her closer to the moment she had been dreading since she picked up that in-flight phone. Her knees felt weak. Her uniform, once pressed and pristine, felt suffocating now, like it was strangling her. The weight of the cabin air, the quiet judgment, the stifling reality of her mistake, it all pressed down on her at once. She had never felt like this before. She had been in tough situations before. Passengers who didn't listen. Entitled travelers who snapped their fingers at her like she was a servant. People who tried to talk their way into upgrades they hadn't paid for. But this wasn't that. This wasn't just a difficult passenger. This was a passenger she had wronged. And she knew deep down that this moment, the humiliation, the judgment, the impending consequences, was something he had felt many times before. The difference, he had never deserved it, but she did. A sudden ding pulled her from her thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate. On behalf of the entire crew, we thank you for flying with us. The finality of the announcement made her stomach clench. She turned her head slightly, peering through the narrow gap in the galley door, watching as passengers started shifting, gathering their things, stretching their legs. Up front, Mr. Harris sat still. He didn't rush to grab his bag. He didn't move like everyone else. He simply waited, calm and composed, as if he already knew how this would end. And he did, because Ms. Taylor wasn't leaving this plane the way she had planned. A shadow fell over her, and she flinched slightly before turning. The captain stood in the galley entrance, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "They're waiting for you outside the jet bridge," he said. Her throat felt dry. "Security?" He gave a slow nod. "And someone from corporate." The words made her dizzy. Corporate. That meant this wasn't just a routine investigation. This wasn't something they were going to sweep under the rug. This was serious. She had known that, of course, but hearing it confirmed by the captain made it all too real. She wanted to plead her case. She wanted to say something, anything, to convince him that this had all been blown out of proportion. But the look on his face told her there was no use. She had spent years controlling the fate of passengers on flights, deciding how to treat them, whether they were worthy of her respect. Now, someone else was deciding her fate, and she didn't have a say in it. "Please exit the aircraft once all passengers have disembarked," the captain said, his voice neutral, professional. And then he left. The walk off the plane. Row by row, passengers stood up, stretching, reaching for their bags, stepping into the aisle. Mr. Harris still didn't move. He let them all go first, let them shuffle past him, let them glance at him one last time, some in quiet guilt, others in silent respect. He had nothing to rush for. This moment belonged to him now. Ms. Taylor remained in the galley, her heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable. One by one, the plane emptied, until only two people remained, Mr. Harris and her. He finally stood, taking his time as he reached for his bag. His movements were slow, deliberate, unshaken. Then, with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the entire flight, he walked down the empty aisle toward the exit. And for the first time since she had made him move, she was the one standing in the back, watching him leave. She felt the sharp sting of poetic justice. He didn't look at her as he passed. He didn't need to. The message was clear. She had treated him like he was beneath her. And now, she wasn't even on his level. He stepped off the plane, and a few seconds later, security stepped on. "Miss Taylor?" She inhaled sharply and turned, her hands clenched at her sides. The officer gave a short nod toward the exit. "Come with us." Her legs felt like lead as she stepped forward, every step toward the jet bridge heavier than the last. The same walkway she had used countless times before now felt like a walk toward the end of everything she had worked for. Passengers were gone. Mr. Harris was gone. But the consequences of her actions, those were waiting for her just beyond the jet bridge. Miss Taylor stepped onto the jet bridge, her breath shallow, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The sterile, gray walls of the walkway felt narrower than usual, pressing in on her as she walked toward what she knew was waiting ahead. Her usually confident steps felt unsteady, her legs heavy with the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just another flight. This wasn't just another difficult passenger situation. This was the end of everything she had built. As she emerged into the terminal, the first thing she saw was the two uniformed security officers standing near the gate, their expressions unreadable. But they weren't the ones that made her stomach drop. It was the man in the navy blue suit standing beside them, Dominic Carter, senior executive, one of the highest-ranking decision-makers in the airline, a man whose name alone could make even the most seasoned employees nervous. She had only seen him once before, years ago, during a corporate visit to her training center. He had given a short speech about professionalism, about how the airline prided itself on excellence in service. Now, he was standing in front of her, his expression cold, his gaze sharp. She stopped in front of him, her pulse hammering. "Ms. Taylor," he said, his voice even, controlled. She swallowed hard. "Sir." He took a slow breath, exhaling through his nose as he glanced at the officers beside him. Then, he turned his eyes back to her. "You'll come with me," he said simply. There was no explanation, no small talk, no attempt to soften the blow, because she already knew why she was here. One of the security officers gestured for her to follow. The walk through the terminal was agonizing. She had walked through this airport hundreds of times. She had worn her uniform with pride, moving through the bustling crowds of travelers with authority, answering questions, directing passengers. ensuring order. Now she was being escorted like a problem that needed to be handled. She saw other flight attendants in passing, their eyes widening slightly before they quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't seen her. She saw a few passengers from her flight lingering near the baggage claim, some of them recognizing her immediately, their whispers hushed but unmistakable. She clenched her jaw, staring straight ahead. She couldn't let them see her break. The executive conference room. When they arrived at the private executive offices near the terminal, the doors shut behind her with a quiet finality that made her chest tighten. The room was cold, modern. A long glass conference table sat in the center, flanked by tall back chairs. She had never been inside this part of the airport before, because flight attendants didn't come here, not unless they were being dealt with. Dominic Carter moved to the head of the table, lowering himself into one of the chairs. He gestured for her to sit across from him. She hesitated for a split second before obeying, lowering herself onto the leather seat, her palms pressing against her thighs to keep from trembling. He took a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the surface of the table. "You've been with this airline for how long?" 10 years, she answered quietly. 10 years, he repeated. "That's a long time." She nodded stiffly, unsure where this was going. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And in those 10 years, have you ever had a passenger removed from first class without verifying their ticket properly?" She hesitated. Yes or no, Ms. Taylor?" His voice was sharp now. She swallowed. "No, sir." He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "Then tell me, what made you so certain that Mr. Harris didn't belong there?" Her throat tightened. She knew what he was asking, and she had no answer that wouldn't condemn her. I assumed there was an error," she said weakly. "You assumed?" he echoed. She bit the inside of her cheek, staring down at her hands. Dominic exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" She nodded once, but he wasn't finished. "You didn't just remove a passenger," he said slowly. "You humiliated a loyal VIP traveler who has been flying with us for years. You treated him differently without cause, and worse, you did it in front of an entire cabin full of people." Her stomach turned. He flipped open a file on the table, sliding a printed complaint across to her. The name at the bottom made her breath hitch. Written by Jonathan Harris, Mr. Harris's grandson. A corporate partner, a stakeholder in the airline, a man whose influence could decide whether she ever worked in this industry again. He sent this complaint directly to the executive board within minutes of takeoff, Dominic said. "You know what that tells me?" She shook her head, her throat dry. "It tells me that the second you removed his grandfather from his seat, he already knew how this was going to end for you." Her breath stuttered. Dominic tapped the paper. "I spoke to him personally before this meeting. He could have asked for anything. Your immediate firing, legal action, public statements. But do you know what he said?" She shook her head again, barely able to speak. "He said he didn't care about what happens to you," Dominic said, his tone cold, "because the worst punishment you could get is knowing exactly why you lost everything." A sharp silence followed. She clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Dominic let the moment sit before he finally closed the file. "The board will decide your termination status within the next 48 hours, he said. "Until then, you're officially suspended without pay. Turn in your badge and your airline ID before you leave this office." She sat frozen, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. "Dismissed," he said simply. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, to defend herself, to explain, to plead. But there was nothing left to say. Her career was over, and worst of all, she had done it to herself. She sat frozen in the chair, the weight of Dominic Carter's words pressing down on her like a boulder she couldn't move. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. But inside her head, everything was deafening. Her heartbeat, her breathing, the realization that this was really happening. She had walked into this airport as a respected flight attendant, someone who held authority, someone who dictated the rules. Now she was sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the airline industry, being dismissed like she was nothing. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Her fingers twitched slightly, itching to reach for the badge clipped onto her uniform. She had worn it for a decade, had taken pride in it, had walked through countless terminals with it pinned neatly to her chest. Now, it felt like a scarlet letter. She swallowed the lump in her throat, reaching up with stiff fingers and unpinning the badge. The small metal clip gave a quiet snap as it came loose. She placed it on the table, her hands unsteady. Then she reached for her airline ID. The card felt heavier than it should have. She had used it to clock into shifts, to pass through security checkpoints, to access employee-only areas. Now she was handing it over like a piece of expired paperwork. She slid it across the table, her fingers brushing against the cold glass surface. Dominic didn't react. He didn't reach for the items immediately. Instead, he let them sit there, untouched, like they no longer had any value. That somehow made it worse. "You're free to go," he said, his voice calm, composed, like this was just another routine meeting for him. For her, it was the end of everything. She forced herself to stand, though her legs felt unsteady. The moment she pushed the chair back, it scraped against the floor, the sound making her wince. She didn't look at Dominic Carter. She couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked toward the door, every step feeling like it carried the weight of 10 years of service being erased. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before gripping the handle. She wanted to turn back, to say something, to defend herself, to ask for a second chance, to plead for mercy. But mercy wasn't something she had given Mr. Harris, and now she wasn't getting it in return. She stepped out of the office, the door closing behind her with a soft but final click. The walk through the terminal. The hallway leading back into the main terminal felt longer than she remembered. The walls seemed taller, the lights too bright, the footsteps of people passing by echoing in her ears. She kept her head down, her hands gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She just needed to get out. She just needed to make it to the parking lot, to her car, to anywhere but here. But fate wasn't done with her yet. As she stepped onto the main concourse, she spotted him, Mr. Harris. He was seated near one of the large windows, a cup of coffee resting on the table in front of him. The soft glow of the sunset spilled through the glass, casting a warm light over his calm face. He wasn't watching her. He didn't need to. She could have walked past him. She could have kept moving, pretended she hadn't seen him. But something in her, something she couldn't quite name, made her stop. For a moment, she just stood there, the distance between them feeling impossibly vast, despite only being a few feet away. Then, as if sensing her presence, Mr. Harris finally looked up. Their eyes met. There was no anger in his expression, no smugness, no satisfaction, just quiet understanding. That made her stomach twist even tighter. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Mr. Harris set down his coffee, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Lost something?" he asked, his tone even. Her throat tightened. She knew what he meant. And she had no answer. She let out a shaky breath. But she couldn't finish. Because what was there to say? That she hadn't meant for things to go this far? That she had just been doing her job? That it wasn't personal? Because it was personal. It had been personal the moment she made a decision about him without knowing a thing about him. Mr. Harris didn't look away. He didn't gloat. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, not of pity, but of acknowledgement. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and returned his gaze to the sunset outside the window, as if she had already ceased to exist. And in that moment, she realized something. He had moved on, and she was the one who would have to live with this forever. Outside the airport, the cool evening air hit her as she stepped through the automatic doors. Her feet carried her to the parking lot, but her mind was stuck inside that plane, inside that terminal, Inside the moment, everything had unraveled. She unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly her fingers ached. For years, she had thought power came from control, from being in charge, from enforcing the rules. But now, sitting alone in her car, with nothing left, she understood the truth. Power had never been in her hands at all. It had been in his. And all it had taken was his silence to destroy everything she had built. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. But she didn't drive away. She just sat there, staring at the blinking airport lights in her rearview mirror, knowing that somewhere inside Mr. Harris was boarding his next flight, moving forward. And she wasn't going anywhere. She sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, the hum of the engine filling the empty space around her. Her mind was spinning, replaying every single moment from the last few hours, trying to make sense of how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She had walked into that flight with certainty, with control, with authority. She had believed she was untouchable, a seasoned professional who knew how to handle passengers, how to run her cabin, how to maintain order. But now she was sitting in the parking lot of an airport where she had worked for 10 years, knowing she might never step inside as an employee again. She had never been on this side of things before. She had never been the one being asked to leave. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. A part of her wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell herself that this was unfair, that she had only been doing her job, that she had followed protocol. But the truth was staring her in the face like a mirror she couldn't look away from. She hadn't followed protocol. She had assumed. She had looked at Mr. Harris and decided in an instant that he didn't belong, that his presence in first class was a mistake. She hadn't checked properly. She hadn't confirmed. She had just acted. And now she was paying for it in a way she never expected. She let out a shaky breath, staring out at the glow of the airport in the distance. Flights were still coming and going, people still moving, business as usual. But her world had stopped. She reached for her phone with stiff fingers, unlocking the screen. The first thing she saw was a notification, her work email. Her stomach twisted as she tapped on it, the screen loading slowly, as if mocking her. Subject: employee status under review. Immediate suspension notice. Her vision blurred slightly as she read the words, though she already knew what they said. She had been suspended before she even left the airport. Her access to the company portal had been revoked. Her schedule had been cleared. She wasn't fired yet, but she knew it was coming. A lump formed in her throat. She had always thought she was irreplaceable, but the cold, professional tone of the email made it clear. She was just another employee, another name on a list, another person who made a mistake big enough for corporate to erase. Her hand trembled slightly as she locked her phone and dropped it onto the passenger seat. What was she supposed to do now? For 10 years, her identity had been wrapped in this job. The long flights, the uniform, the routine. She had poured everything into it, believing it made her somebody. And now, without it, she felt like nobody. She blinked hard, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't the end, it couldn't be. She could fix this. Maybe if she went to corporate. Maybe if she explained. Maybe if she apologized. Would that be enough? Would anything be enough? Her chest tightened. It wasn't just about her job. It was about what she had done. It was about the way she had seen people, the way she had treated them. How many other passengers had she dismissed over the years? How many had walked away from a flight feeling like they didn't belong because of her? A fresh wave of shame washed over her. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost who she thought she was. And no corporate appeal, no desperate explanation, no last-minute attempt to save her career would ever undo what happened in that cabin. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be powerless, and she hated it. A sharp knock on her car window made her flinch. Her head snapped up, her heart pounding. Through the glass, a uniformed officer stood outside her door, his face unreadable. She hesitated before rolling down the window, her fingers unsteady. "Ma'am," he said, his voice neutral. "We need you to vacate the premises." Employees who have been dismissed aren't allowed to linger on airport property. The word sent a fresh jolt through her chest. They were already treating her like she didn't belong, like she was just another former employee. She swallowed hard, forcing a stiff nod. "I understand." The officer gave a small, professional nod before stepping back. She rolled up the window, her face burning with humiliation. They were kicking her out, and she couldn't even argue. She reached for the gear shift, her fingers stiff, and put the car into reverse. As she backed out of the parking space, she caught one last glimpse of the airport in her rearview mirror. For 10 years, this place had been her home. Now, it was just another place she wasn't welcome. She pulled onto the road, gripping the wheel tighter, her vision blurring slightly. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing. She would never be coming back. The road stretched ahead of her, dark and endless, illuminated only by the occasional glow of streetlights and the red taillights of distant cars. She had driven this route countless times before, heading home after long shifts, exhausted but satisfied, knowing she had done her job. But this drive was different. There was no exhaustion, no sense of accomplishment, just an overwhelming emptiness. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white. The silence in the car was suffocating, but she couldn't bring herself to turn on the radio. Any noise would only remind her of what she was trying to ignore. Her career was over. Her reputation was shattered. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Her mind drifted back to Mr. Harris, to the way he had looked at her. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone who had won, but with something worse. Disappointment. It had been written all over his face, and that was what hurt the most. She had always believed she was fair, that she treated passengers professionally, that she followed the rules. But today, she had been forced to see herself through someone else's eyes. She had looked at Mr. Harris and made a decision about him before he had even spoken. She had assumed, and in that assumption, she had exposed something about herself that she hadn't been ready to face. How many times had she done this before? How many passengers had she dismissed over the years, their frustration ignored, their dignity quietly taken from them? And how many of them had simply walked away, carrying that silent humiliation with them, knowing there was nothing they could do? The realization settled in her chest like a stone. She had been part of the problem, and now she was paying for it. A sharp beep from her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, expecting another work email, another cold notification from corporate. But it wasn't from her job. It was from her sister. "Just saw something about you on social media. Call me." Her stomach lurched. Social media? Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone. The screen refreshed, and there it was. Her name trending on multiple platforms, news articles, video clips from the flight, and worst of all, passenger recordings. One headline made her blood run cold. "Flight attendant removed elderly black man from first class and gets fired before the plane lands." Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scrolled. The video was there. Someone had recorded the entire thing. The moment she had stood over Mr. Harris, questioning his seat, demanding he move, barely listening when he tried to explain. Then, the second video, the one where she was forced to walk back down the aisle and apologize. The humiliation was written all over her face, frozen in time for the world to see. Thousands of comments flooded the post. She didn't even check his ticket, just assumed. Disgusting. Glad she got what was coming to her. How many times has this happened before and no one caught it on camera? She lost her job in real time. That's karma. I feel no sympathy for her. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just about the airline anymore. This was everywhere. She scrolled further, her breathing shallow. More headlines, more comments, more people dissecting every moment of what had happened. Some were calling for her to be permanently banned from working in the airline industry. Some were already finding her personal information, her address, her family's social media pages. Her vision blurred as panic set in. This wasn't just a job loss. This was her entire life crumbling in real time. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat like it had burned her, gripping the wheel as her breath came faster. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be happening. She blinked rapidly, trying to push back the rising fear, the sharp realization that she wasn't just out of a job, she was about to lose everything. The internet never forgets. And neither would the world. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles aching from the pressure. The road ahead blurred, the streetlights stretching into long streaks of light as panic settled deep in her chest. This wasn't just about her job anymore. This was her life. Her name was trending. Her face was plastered across every news outlet, every social media platform, every conversation happening in comment sections filled with strangers who would never meet her, but who already hated her. And the worst part? She couldn't even argue with them because they were right. She had assumed, she had humiliated him, she had treated Mr. Harris differently, and now the world had seen it. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers, hesitating before unlocking it again. The screen lit up, filled with notifications, messages from old coworkers, acquaintances, people she barely knew but who suddenly had something to say. What the hell happened? Did you really get fired? You're all over the news. But there was one message that stood out, a name she hadn't seen pop up in a long time. Her mother. She swallowed hard before tapping it open. It was short. No anger, no judgment. Just 4 words. What have you done? Her chest tightened. She could have handled strangers attacking her. She could have handled losing her job. But this, the shame of knowing her own family was seeing her like this, watching her fall apart in real time, watching her mistakes spread across the internet like wildfire. That was something she hadn't prepared for. She let the phone drop onto the passenger seat again, pressing the heel of her palm against her forehead, trying to force herself to breathe. What was she supposed to do now? She had spent 10 years working towards something, building a reputation, making a name for herself. And in one flight, one choice, one moment, it was gone. She was nothing now, no job, no future in the airline industry, no way to escape the mess she had created. Because this wasn't something that would disappear in a few days. This would follow her forever. The realization struck like a hammer to the chest. She was never going to escape this. This wasn't just a mistake. This was who she had been all along. And now the world had seen it. Her fingers curled into fists as she stared ahead at the dark road, the airport shrinking in her rearview mirror. Somewhere inside, Mr. Harris was probably boarding his next flight, moving forward. But she had nowhere to go. And for the first time in her life, she finally understood what it felt like to be the one left behind. That's the story. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your opinion, and subscribe for more stories like this.